We often talk about environmentalism and the environmental movement as if it were one idea. There are really lots of ideas and lots of issues, some of them very complicated, as we move around the world. I'd like to identify, however, at least 4 different mindsets that we find in the environmental movement in people who think about the environment. The first one I'm going to call the conservation mindset. And it really is a very old mindset. It comes from really the fact that environmentalism didn't start recently. The Sierra Club, for instance, was started by John Muir in 1896 in the U.S. And it focused on the preservation of nature as opposed to the idea that there was this unlimited frontier, unlimited resources to be exploited. An idea that sounds very modern today, but it's there in the 19th century in the U.S. The first environmental treaty, the first international environmental treaty, was actually signed in 1886. Today there are hundreds of them. The treaty concerning the regulation of salmon fishing in the Rhine River Basin in 1886 was signed by Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. So there's a little bit of trivia that will make you fascinating people at parties after you've had this course. On the other hand, people like Gifford Pinchot, who was educated in the European forestry schools, embodied the idea of a more careful use of nature for economic development that became really known not as preservation, preserving nature, but as conservation, conserving nature, using it wisely. We preserve nature when we keep it like it is. We conserve it when we try and use it wisely. And this distinction between preservation and conservation turns out to be important. Pinchot also embodied the idea of using resources for essentially the good of society rather than only private gain. Often conservation efforts were supported and even led by businesses, especially those who were in the natural resource business. This early conservation movement was tied to the interests of both governments and business, at least in the U.S. Think about, for instance, land set-aside programs. That's about preservation. Think about tree planting programs as conserving the resources that we have. These are still in full force in today's world. In the 1960s, there was a second mindset that emerged, and it's something I'm going to call the social justice mindset. The social justice mindset says, gee, it looks like there are haves and there are have-nots here. And it looks like the haves are sending a lot of their waste products to the have-nots. Toxic waste, often shipped to lesser developed countries. Waste that is problematic in developed countries, often put in rural, undeveloped parts of the country that had little political power. Sometimes hazards, environmental hazards, were left in the neighborhoods of those who are not empowered in society. And many people began to argue that environmental practices simply didn't take seriously the interests of women. People began to lobby for changes in political structures that supported what they saw as oppression. This is still a very large part of environmentalism today. Think about policies and laws that prevent toxic waste from being shipped. The fact that some place will accept your shipments doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And lots of policies and procedures are aimed at social justice here as well, a sense of fairness. Growing out of this is a third mindset, which has had a big impact on the environmental movement. It's something I would call the deep ecology mindset. It tries to argue that we need to learn how to live more in harmony with nature. We need to learn to live not against nature, not trying to conserve its resources, not trying to figure out what to do with toxic waste, but trying not to make any toxic waste. It comes from the idea that we really are a part of nature. We're animals, and as such, we need to figure out our place in nature. Arne Næss, a Scandinavian philosopher, was one of the first to articulate this point of view in the 1970s. Deep ecologists usually deny the superiority of human beings and affirm the right of all living things to flourish. Think about the move to local and organic food as examples of saying, let's figure out how to live more in concert, more in tune with the places that we are. In the words of the poet Wendell Berry, life exists because of 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains every now and then, and we need to remember that. There's a fourth mindset that's really become the dominant one. It draws from all of the other three, and I'm going to call that the sustainability mindset. It's fast becoming what you might call the dominant paradigm. John Elkington and a company called Sustainability have suggested that at its broadest, sustainability mindset tries to capture the set of values, issues, and processes that companies have to address to minimize the harm that results from their actions on the environment. People have argued that we need to think about 3 bottom lines: a financial bottom line, a social bottom line, and an environmental bottom line. And thinking about this triple bottom line approach is one of the hallmarks of thinking about sustainability. Sustainability in the sense of the whole enterprise has to thrive over time. And you can only do that if you're paying attention to the environment. So we see business set in society thinking about a business sustaining itself over time by paying attention to the effects that it has on the environment. What I want you to think about and talk about in the discussion forums is, why should a business worry about the environment? And furthermore, why should you as a customer or an employee worry about the environment?